All righty. Well, good afternoon, everybody. So glad that you can join us today. My name is James Castaneda. I am the Vice President of Administration for APA California, and I am kicking this off on behalf of our chapter president, Carrie Fernandez. And it's so fantastic that we're continuing on with this series on wildfire recovery. So today's episode is actually very interesting. This is continuing on with our theme on resiliency and all the other items that have been going on with wildfires. This one in particular had started earlier this year with an effort from the Los Angeles County to put together a Blue Ribbon Commission. So we're very fortunate that we've had three members of that commission to tell us a lot more about their experiences on that commission, as well as some of the outcomes and findings from that document, which is out now, and we'll put a link in the notes for that to download that. Moderating our discussion is none other than Rob Olshansky. I can't think of anybody else better who can do this conversation in light of his work in this field, being one of the co-authors of After Great Disasters. So I'm going to hand it to him for this great discussion. So Rob, it's your show. Take it away.
Hey, thanks, James. I'm going to give a very, very brief introduction because our panelists have a lot to say. Again, the purpose today is to learn about the report that was just issued in June by the Blue Ribbon Commission on Climate Action and Fire Safe Recovery. This was an initiative that was organized by County Supervisor Lindsay Horvath. There were 20 members of the commission, all volunteers, and they were supported by a staff of 9 researchers from UCLA, which was supported by the California Community Foundation. The 3 members we have today, we have them here because they all have planning perspectives to offer. They all have professional planning degrees. They all have very long professional bios, which you can find on our Cal APA wildfire webpage. But I'm going to just give a few highlights as we lead into them. So we have Cecilia Estolano, who not only has a planning degree, but also law. She has over 30 years of experience in strategic, economic, and sustainable urban development, all pretty much in Southern California, serving in multiple roles, notably as CEO of the LA Community Redevelopment Agency when it existed, and with her long time with her firm, Estolano Advisors. Laurie Schoeman works in housing policy and climate resilience. Most of that work was on the East Coast, but she has 6 years experience as a planner in the San Francisco Bay Area. Most notably, her work with Enterprise for 10 years in climate resilience and housing disaster recovery. And she also worked in the Biden White House as a senior advisor on those same topics, climate resilience and housing disaster recovery. And then finally, Laurie Johnson, FAICP, who is the other co-author of After Great Disasters. So I've known her for a long time. She's an urban planner specializing in disaster recovery and catastrophic risk management. Most notably, there was her work on the Unified New Orleans Plan after Hurricane Katrina. She worked with the city of Christchurch after the 2011 earthquakes. And recently, she served as the Chief Catastrophe Response and Resiliency Officer for the California Earthquake Authority, which also involved setting up the newly formed California Wildfire Fund. And I'll stop there, and I'm going to turn it over. We have 2 Laurie today, so I'm going to turn it over to Laurie J., who's going to be running the show.
Sorry, just getting the slides loaded up here.
Okay. And if there's any issues.
And just want to say that Laurie Schoeman is a California girl. She has a 415 area code cell phone.
Oh, there you go.
Thank you for qualifying.
Never let it go.
Even I don't have one.
We claim her in the Bay Area. Okay, can you guys see that?
I'll take it.
Great. So Rob covered some of this already. I'll just emphasize a few things, that this is an independent commission. So we were not established formally through government. We did not have therefore any public meeting notice requirements, which was nice as a commission. So it gave us some flexibility to do our work, although we did interact a lot with elected officials throughout this process, as well as a whole number of other community leaders, survivors, and other stakeholders. Our charge by Supervisor Horvath was really to give some recommendations on the subjects of climate action and fire safe recovery, to rebuild in a more resilient way, and that she hoped those recommendations would be adopted by all the various government bodies at all levels of government, but also influence the rebuilding process overall. So Rob mentioned the commission. Here's just a copy of all the commission members. I'll just say it's been really an honor to be on this. I think Laurie Schoeman and I sort of felt we know LA people, but we've gotten to know a lot more LA people as part of this process, and just a really great dedicated group of community leaders, former government officials who really understand the LA area. And we also were really honored to have the support of UCLA. Rob mentioned 9 people, but actually behind them sat a whole bunch of other people as well. And UCLA brought to us also experts from all sorts of universities and other areas of research and policy to provide us with input along in the process. And then we also want to acknowledge all the community members that engaged with us along the way. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. As Rob said, UCLA's work in particular was supported by the California Community Foundation. Also, the Waverly Street Foundation contributed, and all the various companies, including our chair, Matt Peterson, and the Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator, gave incredible resources to this. As he mentioned, this was all pro bono time for all of us. So a lot of contributions for a lot of people that I want to acknowledge. We had a very tight timeline from Commissioner Horvath, and I think all of us who have been involved in disasters knew that if we really wanted to influence the process, we had to move quickly. So we were officially announced on February 13th. We had a 2-day kickoff retreat down at UCLA at the end of February. We formed some smaller working groups and really then proceeded through the next few months in those groups with occasional check-ins, I think once every 2 weeks as a full commission, and then 2 more in-person meetings during the process. When we first met, we realized there were things we had to say very soon, particularly around health and safety for workers and for residents, as the areas where the debris removal process was kicking off and people were trying to get back into their neighborhoods. So we had an early actions recommendation that came out in March. We then produced an initial set of recommendations, a more lengthy document that we called with draft action plans. And really the key for that document was really to have something to share in our community engagement process. We started that formally in April, but it ran for 3 months, and UCLA was really key in sort of organizing that, working with the various community organizations that have formed as well. And then we also had some of the in the neighborhoods, but then we also had like the Department of Angels and philanthropy across Southern California supporting us and making connections too. We published our final recommendations in June. We had a launch event on June 20th down in Southern California for that as well. So there are themes in that sort of match our 6 working groups, but they sort of subdivided over time. And I'm not going to go through all of our recommendations, but we had a few that rose to the top as immediate recommendations, and I'll spend a little time talking about that. But then we also had recommendations around infrastructure, water, energy in particular, buildings, the landscape around buildings, neighborhood scale, community scale, and the wildland areas. Insurance reform is something that really, was working in parallel to this process. So we swept that in as part of this. Land use and workforce issues, which Cecilia was very involved, led that group. Community and equity, this really was a place where we took up the social service and community scale needs. And then we also had finance and governance, which eventually became 2 different groups. Laurie and Cecilia and I were all very involved in a number of these. And then I'll just want to emphasize that these recommendations for urgent action, I think just this is really where, as people ask us, what are we doing next? We've been working to communicate our recommendations with a real focus on these ones that we feel need to be done in the short term. And we're going to emphasize a couple of those, share a couple of those with you today. One is the call for a region-wide resilient rebuilding authority for the 2 burn areas. The other is community-led recovery planning. And then we'll talk a little bit about the financing issues since we have Laurie here as our expert. But you can see there are some other really important issues as the debris removal program is wrapping up in the residential areas. If you go to these neighborhoods, you'll see that for many commercial areas, nothing has changed since the day after the fire, which has implications both for health, but blight and just neighborhood recovery. So we're trying to see if the federal program, which is only focused on residential properties, can be expanded. So we've been advocating for that. We've been advocating for more health and safety related measures for soils, air, protection of workers as well. And then issues as we transition into the long-term recovery around housing recovery, where benefits should go if there are benefits coming out. And then things like mental health as well. And also one of the things that we are advocating for is the extension of the California WUI standard to the entire rebuild, not just areas that are inside the high fire severity zones. So with that, I'm going to move forward into the talking about the Resilient Rebuilding Authority and turn that over to Cecilia.
Thanks, Laurie. I also want to underscore, well, first of all, let me thank APA, Rob and James for having us here today, and Laurie for organizing us, Laurie J. I also want to underscore what an honor it was to serve on this body and to learn so much from the 2 Lauries and others on the commission. It was really an extraordinary experience. And I'll note that everyone engaged in it was really about trying to have the most practical, relevant recommendations, really trying to get to the heart of things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Rebuilding Authority. And I want to make sure Laurie has a lot of time to talk about financing because they are intimately related. So the main thing here is for a disaster at this scale, regular business as usual in terms of rebuilding just won't do it. You have to have some extraordinary authority, a centralized authority that's able to buy and sell land, assemble properties, do centralized contracting for materials, for builders, try to get the economies of scale to coordinate the infrastructure development and the staging of development so that you're not rebuilding the streets, for example, 4, 5, 6, 7 times as different people are rebuilding their lots. It also is important to be able to look at issues beyond just rebuilding, but are part of the necessity of getting that done. Things like workforce development and training that otherwise might not happen in a focused way around these particular areas to make sure that we have the workforce necessary to come in and do the rebuilding. And let me tell you, in Los Angeles, where we're having regular raids and shows of terror by the federal government, this isn't a small matter. Most of our workforce, construction workforce, is Latino. A fair number of it, a large percentage, is immigrant. And so we are seeing a chilling effect in the availability of construction workers. We saw that even before these raids, and it's now exacerbated. So this issue needs to be tackled in a comprehensive way. And then another element, which I know is of great importance to planners, is that there be a place that folks know is solely responsible for doing this. This is a focal point, a place where there can be substantial input and guidance from community members most directly affected. And so part of our recommendations dealt with who's going to sit on the governing board of the authority, or will there be an advisory committee comprised of residents and property owners and business owners from the community, because those who have most affected actually oftentimes come up with the best solutions for problems at this scale. So key authorities, and I don't know if that's the next slide, Laurie, some of the key powers that are available would be to be able to marshal the use of tax increment financing. And this is a really powerful tool that we had in California. We were actually the pioneer behind tax increment financing back in the day, and then we ended it in 2012 as a result of a pretty severe financial crisis in the state. But be that as it may, we do have quite a bit of experience using tax increment financing to focus redevelopment. In this case, so just blighted properties. In this case, tax increment financing, and we envision the county and the city sharing the increased property taxes that come from increased value as lots begin to be rebuilt, that increment can then be used to issue bonds, public bonds, and the repayment source for those bonds is the increase in property tax revenue coming to the city and the county. Why is this important? We really need to be able to assemble lots at scale. We're talking about 16,000 structures destroyed, 6,000 properties in Altadena alone, which is the Eaton Canyon fire where I used to live. And so the idea is, even if you could just acquire 400 lots from willing sellers, from property owners who don't have the wherewithal, have a gap between what their insurance is covering, or maybe they weren't insured at all, or they just don't get enough insurance proceeds to rebuild, but they want to make sure their property, they receive a fair value for that. The authority could use the bond proceeds they get from tax increment financing and then purchase those lots, hold on to them, do centralized, as we noted, purchase of construction materials, could contract with maybe 3 or 4 or 5 merchant builders, have some standardized designs, and quickly get houses rebuilt, and then be able to offer those back to former property owners that might want to come back in. And that idea of being able to purchase land, hold on to it, get it ready for development, see it develop through, doing all of that nitty-gritty work that is so difficult for property owners on their own to take on, that is an enormous benefit of this rebuilding authority. I'll also note, and I know Laurie's going to touch on it in her presentation, so I'm not going to talk about it too much, but it also becomes the focal point for contributions from philanthropy and others, public-private partnerships, where folks just want to have some sense of security that there is a transparent way that money is being spent, that there's accountability for it, that there's a work plan that people can see. So that's also really important. It's also important because there's a lot of focus on the single family homeowners because they're the ones who are mostly had their properties destroyed. But as Laurie Johnson noted, you have commercial properties where nothing's being done. They did not get the benefit of this FEMA and county-led clearance program. So many of them don't even have the money to clear their own lots. Retail's a tough thing to manage even in the best of circumstances post-COVID, and they may not have been sufficiently insured to be able to rebuild. So in many ways, a rebuilding authority might be the only way to make sure these neighborhoods serving locally owned retail centers, main streets, as it were, are able to come back. That's a really important element of having a rebuilding authority, because left to its own devices, the market is not likely to rebuild neighborhoods serving retail at a reasonable cost with locally owned businesses. A last thing I'm going to note, and there's so much we could talk about what some of the activities that the authority could do, but the last piece, which I know Laurie S. would also like to talk about, and Laurie J. as well, is housing. So we not only lost single family housing, we also lost something like 700 units of apartment buildings. We also lost mobile home parks. And these were essential sources of affordable or workforce housing. So it enabled folks in Pacific Palisades, people like nurses and social workers and teachers could live in the Palisades in some of these units. Without some intervention by this type of authority, it is unlikely that those apartment buildings will come back and be rebuilt at rental levels where regular working people can come back in. Because of the cost of constructions, it's likely they'd be at much higher rents. So this is a way for us to intervene, purchase some of those properties, make sure they get rehabbed and redeveloped for affordable housing or workforce housing to match the income levels and diversity in both communities by holding down some of the rents, and also by taking advantage of economies of scale in terms of construction material costs and just the ease of efficiency of construction and the ability to do deals with developers. So those are some of the reasons why we felt very strongly that this type of rebuilding authority should be constructed. And I'd actually like to pass it back to Laurie, because she's the one who was really one of the strongest advocates because of her experience dealing with recovery all across the country, she noted that the best recoveries typically happen when you have this type of centralized authority. So, Laura, I'm going to pass it back to you to make this case because I think you do it better than anybody.
Well, I think we'll come back to that, and let's let Laurie Schoeman talk first about financing while we're on that topic. And then why don't you and I come back to that since Laurie has to step away. How's that?
Sounds good.
Okay, so this is just to tee up for Laurie, the finance specific recommendations in our report, but finance, as Cecilia said, is a question mark and a key issue throughout the document.
Well, I want to echo Cecilia and Laurie Johnson's, their remarks about how much of an honor it was to be part of this commission, and is, because we're not done. And I was especially honored because, yes, I spent a decade in California. Yes, I still have my 415. I got schooled by in planning in New York City, and I hope some of my colleagues are on this call from New York. But I ended up in the swamp of DC when I joined the White House. So here I am, and they were nice enough to let me participate, even though I was in DC. And it was an extraordinary process, which I have to say, I think is a model for other communities around the nation. We're looking at incredible disasters around the country. And what we asked ourselves was, how do we not only rebuild, but rebuild in a resilient way? That's the question we need to all ask ourselves as we see exponential risk from a changing climate and a warming globe, which is playing out before us in very tragic ways. So I just want to say a couple of remarks about financing. When I went to planning school, I did not have any classes in finance. I never was told that, business or having any acumen and investment is a part of a planner's job or scope. I would say that the entire planning profession needs to be rethought and redesigned, sorry, Rob, to accommodate for financing. Because without financing, without the capital we can't get anything done. I have spoken to dozens of communities around the country on a variety of planning themes. And the evergreen question is always, well, how are we going to pay for it? And so we need to have answers. And so this commission made an attempt at creating some really important answers and sort of moonshots to help us think about how we're going to finance this work. I will say, typically in a disaster, a community will receive several tranches of support from the feds. They come in the form of emergency assistance, which is usually your FEMA, public assistance, individual assistance, small business administration, et cetera. But the long-term recovery funding, which is usually provided by HUD and allocated by the Congress, has to come in to play a supporting role in capitalizing longer-term recovery. Right now, we're in a situation where the federal administration is run by someone who doesn't favor California right now, and we are seeing a slowdown in getting funding for this longer-term support, which we desperately need. Therefore, we looked at what other ways can we bring in some capital to help supplement California to make sure that we are able to provide support for the lowest income communities around the county and the city. So we have three basic ideas that we wanted to that we're working on advancing. One is making sure, I'll start with the actual campaign. We're looking at, we need some private discretionary funding to support rebuilding. But this funding should come from the private sector and the philanthropic sector. We're looking at a $200 million raise for the county and to redevelop. This funding would come from a variety of sources. It can be used to do a variety of things to not only supplement federal funding when it comes in, but to bridge some of the federal funding, maybe to even provide some kind of a backstop guarantee for federal funding. This is the kind of funding we need to be flexible and patient. And so this fund is something that we're looking at deploying, and the redevelopment authority would have a hand in helping to deploy it. We're also looking at what other entities could deploy this funding. We thought about, housing community development, right? At the state, you could look at public housing. So ultimately, we just need to have a pool of funding that we can access to help us supplement the gaps and the needs. that federal funding will not support or cannot support. Secondly, we think it's really important that we coordinate financiers and institutions that are providing funding so that we're not only coordinated, but we're working together in partnership to align products and standards. Just as an example, and I don't want to, we could talk about this for a long time. I raised capital for a community development finance institution, which is a national CDFI that brings funding in from CRA banks. So we basically bring in funding, we deploy it at a low cost, it's patient and flexible. It's deployed for housing. We work with a lot of affordable housing. One of the things we're doing at my organization is we're working across the CDFI ecosystem in LA to say, what's the table we can set so we can streamline and make the asks to banks and the deployment of the funding more efficient. So that's just an example of the way we're trying to think about how do we coordinate. The last piece we talked about is how do we ensure that we rebuild housing in a way that will be expedient and equitable? And one of the issues that many of the communities face is they have land that's left after the fire. They do not have a structure on that land. The way to get it, to build anything, you need cash, you need liquid. So how do you get liquidity to the property? You basically establish what's called a soft second mortgage, which is essentially secured by the property. It gives you the cash you need to rebuild, and that's the kind of creativity we need to be thinking about. There's also discussions about getting cash or liquidity to build what's called accessory dwelling units that the resident could live in until they get their main house up. So there's a lot of discussion around how the mortgaging finance industry can be creative here. What we don't want to happen is households sell their properties to investors that are basically going to build luxury housing and gentrify the community. So one of the things our CDFI table is looking at is how do we build in some kind of a land banking idea? And Cecilia has a lot to say about this. Some kind of a land bank, a community trust where we can front load the purchase of that land and take it out of the private market so that community members can have access to it. Because I'll say in final conclusion, we all know on this call that housing is the primary source and in many cases only source of wealth generation for Americans. So all this together will lead us to bring in some real capital at a time where the city, the state, the county is really strapped. So I'm going to pass it back to you, Laurie and Cecilia. Thanks for inviting me to speak about this.
Thanks. And I can't stress enough what Laurie's point is about the supplemental funding that typically comes for long-term recovery. After Hurricane Sandy, which occurred in October of 2012, I think late October, that supplemental was made, I think, by January, where the congressional delegations from the most affected states, New Jersey, New York, came together, worked together and with all the various agencies to come up with estimates of the need. In this case, not even just that long-term CDBG money, but what I've been learning through, I was at a meeting this week between FEMA and Cal OES, is even the supplementals for some of the emergency related work hasn't been allocated. So for example, the debris removal program and this need that has been acknowledged by many to provide, extend that very capable program to include mobile homes, apartment buildings, not just single family lots, and commercial properties, churches, all the various other sort of community supporting locations in a neighborhood. That some of that additional supplemental that they needed and requested hasn't been provided either. So that's just one example of some of the gaps that we're facing right now. And you have agencies just working to maximize what they have and get it on the ground as quickly as possible so that it can influence and fill holes that would have come through other supplemental grants. So we'll go back here a couple of slides. I think we were here, right, Cecilia?
That's right, Laurie. And I thought maybe you could speak to this slide because you've done this work. And in fact, I think the first person in the room who said, you know what you all really need to recommend first, what we need to recommend first is a recovery authority. And many of us had come into that room thinking the same thing, but then to have you as a disaster recovery expert describe all the other examples was so compelling. So I think you're the best to do this one.
Okay, well, I cut my chops as a researcher along with Rob Olshansky studying the rebuilding after the Northridge earthquake and the Loma Prieta earthquakes, and sort of came into planning thinking that's the toolkit that we have. And I just listed here for you all the different redevelopment agency led activities just in California post disaster. So a lot of these are earthquakes, even some of them are very moderate earthquakes, but like Coalinga, as an example, in the Central Valley, got hit by an earthquake in 1983. It had a very old main street of unreinforced masonry buildings, very vulnerable to collapse. Also a main street that's typical of America, where as Walmart came in and various other entities started developing malls, et cetera, on the outskirts of town, Main Street was kind of underutilized and undervalued. So Coalinga established a redevelopment agency, used that to do is exactly as Cecilia said, to consolidate those lots, consolidate funding, work with those property owners to recover and not only just repair those buildings, but actually retrofit them and build them more resiliently. So that's just one example. Santa Rosa, the same in its old Main Street. If you go down there today, all of that was rebuilt after the 1969 earthquakes that they had there. So that power was super important in LA after Northridge. It's really how Hollywood rebuilt. Hollywood today exists because of the redevelopment plan that was in place and the money that came. That plan had been in place for a while, I think like almost 10 years. And then it was really the money that came into LA after Northridge that allowed the city to move forward and work with developers for redeveloping Hollywood into the attractive location that it is now today. When redevelopment doesn't exist, we see extraordinary legislation typically gets passed. The Lower Manhattan Development Corporation is an offshoot of the Empire State Development Corporation in New York, which is essentially a state-led redevelopment type agency. And they dedicated a focused subsidiary for rebuilding Lower Manhattan after the 9/11 tragedy. The Louisiana Recovery Authority is a slightly different animal in that it was not a redevelopment agency in that it didn't have tax increment financing policies, but it was established because the state recognized, given the widespread destruction in Katrina, that there needed to be consistent policy making and planning done for how that money was going to be used across the state, because otherwise that money might be distributed, unevenly to where the needs were. And so the Louisiana Recovery Authority was more of a planning and policy making authority, but it functioned in those ways like a redevelopment agency would, putting together a plan for an impacted area, really assessing and understanding the unmet needs and gaps in financing, and then working to direct funding to various policies and directing agencies within the state to undertake certain types of work. And then also worked with redevelopment agencies like New Orleans Redevelopment Agency, NORA, to implement some of that work. So for those of you who have only been in the workforce since 2012, we had this in California. It did go away, and one of the biggest gaps for us as disaster researchers has been losing that authority, because I think, as Cecilia described, it does so many things. So there is a piece of legislation right now in Sacramento, Senate Bill 549, is that right, Cecilia? I think that's working its way through to hopefully give a special exemption and creation of this special purpose authority for these two burn areas. And I think I will turn it back to Cecilia now to talk about also community-led recovery planning, which this authority might do. And if it doesn't get established, we're really pushing for it to be done by the county and the city.
Yeah, thanks so much, Laurie. And the reason we really want to talk about this is because we spent a lot of time hearing about and listening to folks who were affected by these firestorms. And, you know, we had a few members of the commission who actually were personally displaced. I'm one of them. I was displaced from the Eaton Canyon fire, and we had some other commissioners who were affected by Palisades and also Eaton Canyon. What we've seen in these communities is, and Laurie, I think this is probably pretty common, right? This extraordinary flowering of community-led efforts to organize and plan and vision and try to really figure out what to do next. And I think typically the Community Development Block Grant disaster recovery funds would help support some kind of visioning and planning process, because as much as people want to rebuild immediately, the reality is it takes a while, right? So this isn't a sprint, it's a marathon. It can take 5, 10, 20 years to recover. If we do it right, and it's kind of like, you know, measure twice, cut once. If we really do good planning processes during this time, now that the immediate shock is over, we're now 6 months into this, people can begin to think, I think, more deliberately and more in a more visionary way about what they want their community to come back as, and what are the most important features of the community, what are the trade-offs that they want to make. That type of community-driven listening and visioning needs to happen. And one thing we felt really strongly about is the groups that have bubbled up and have done so much work on their own, basically unsupported, while they're managing their own trauma and their own displacement. Those groups need to be resourced. And this is something that an authority could help fund. An authority could help resource. It could maybe create a bank of consultants that can help these groups, either through facilitation, expert resources like financial analysis, architecture, landscape architecture, any number of other skill sets, engineers, hydrologists, those type of bank of consultants that they could draw upon as they do their visioning sessions. So this is really written as if there weren't going to be an authority, but we really think that that notion of maybe the philanthropic sector can dedicate some funds for this, or if the authority gets stood up, it should dedicate some resources to this. But this is very, very important. We as planners, I think, have all come to realize that the top-down planning only gets you so far. And when it comes to a marathon of a recovery, you're going to have the best, longest lasting, and most enduring positive impact if you can achieve some level of consensus or collaboration and agreement around the direction of the community from the community, so that they see that they are engaged in this and they're not being cut out from under, they're not being displaced from a power standpoint by outside investors and developers, that they are actually back in the game. And so both communities, both in the Eaton fire in Altadena and in the east side of the county, as well as the folks in the Palisades in Malibu and Sunset Mesa, expressed the desire to have some way to continue to do their planning. So we just wanted to lift up this recommendation. It's not one that's gotten a lot of attention, but we think that the authority can actually play a very important role in seeing this through. And with that, I'll send it back to you, Laurie.
I think we have, am I not moving forward? Here we go. One slide after this, and then we'll go to Q&A. Other sort of overarching governance piece that I just want to highlight is we are also calling for the creation of a regional fire control district focused on prevention, vegetation management, and really for those of us in Northern California, really looked very carefully at Marin County's Wildfire Authority and the model that's been created there, essentially pulling together the resources of all the jurisdictions, all the different fire districts in Marin County, organizing what is essentially a planning process to figure out vegetation and vulnerability of different neighborhoods, you know, and prioritizing the use of those funds according to the risk. We are calling for a similar type of entity that would, as Marin County is doing, tax property owners over a period of time to generate that revenue, and then also do the planning and allocation of those resources in a more cohesive way. So this also requires some sort of legislative action and possibly, or most likely also voter approval. So that's also something that we've been trying to tee up. And I think there was a question about sort of like, these are ideas that others have been advocating for. I think one of the things I just want to say in this is that, you know, this really was a moving process as ideas are being generated at all levels by, government people, by the various other types of, ULI, Department of Angels, other groups that came together to help. And then also, by residents themselves. And so in part, we're in dialogue. People like Cecilia live in these impacted areas. So what we're trying to do is not necessarily claim these as our own original ideas, but basically use the vessel that we had as a commission to bring forward good ideas and advocate for them. And I can tell you that we as commission members, and especially our chair, Matt Peterson, is on the street, and Cecilia as well, doing briefings with elected officials, driving up and testifying in Sacramento, to get these ideas that are not just ours, but are good ideas that are vetted by the community, but get the powers and the approvals that we need to make these things happen. So I think that is our last slide. Yes, it is. Here, if you want to scan that, there's the QR code to get to the report, and we have a website, which is LABR Commission. So Rob, I'll turn it back to you, and just want to thank Laurie and Cecilia again for joining us and participating today. We'll open it up for some questions.
Well, thank you. It was a lot of stuff. And there's a lot in the report. And also there's a link to the report at the top of the chat. So I have some related questions. We'll see how we go with this, but they all basically are pragmatically what happens now. And so the first one, so short of an authority, so I understand, so there's a bill, hopefully this will happen, but short of that, what are some of the other possible ways that we can be thinking very practically about financing, supporting, and importantly, as you've noted, need for coordinating recovery activities? What are some of the other ways that we might be able to, in parallel, be moving towards some of these?
I don't know if Laurie S. wants to address the financing piece, and maybe I can take on some of the planning piece. Laurie, are you able to respond?
Yeah, I would just say, can you hear me okay, Cecilia?
Yep, we can hear you.
Yes.
I would just say this, we are all moving forward. Banks, foundations, which the Southern California Philanthropy Collaborative led by Lily Bui is leading in this incredible effort with lots of foundations, trying to figure out how do they invest their funds. Banks are leaning in and saying, we want to invest in the recovery. We are obliged through the Community Reinvestment Act to do that. We are committed. Where do we go? We have impact investors trying to figure out how to come in with, supportive capital. So this is the moment when this plan came forward, it is a helpful roadmap for a lot of folks to think about how to move forward with investments. We are all waiting for the federal dollars to come in as well, because the federal dollars provide us with the repayment for loans that will need to be, provided to rebuilding. Because a lot of this money is not going to be just subsidy. It's not going to just be grants. It's going to have to be structured in a way that it's sustainable. So you're going to have lending that needs to happen that's supportive and concessionary. So I would say this is the moment that if you're interested in leaning in to the financing piece, lean in. We've set a goal of 200 million for discretionary fund. We'd like to see more. But here's the thing, if you want to be supportive as well, is to try to figure out and focus on getting the message out that we need federal financing, federal money through HUD and through Congress. And we really do think that this package is going to be put forward at some point, given all the stuff happening in Texas, that we'll be seeing a package coming in the next month or two. But we're way off from getting certainty around that. So that's what I would say on the financing piece.
Yeah, thanks, Laurie. I'll just maybe briefly touch on the coordination stuff. Look, the city of Los Angeles, the other cities, Malibu, Sierra Madre, Pasadena, the county of Los Angeles, in terms of the unincorporated areas, they are trying to coordinate, right? I think the key is, do you have an agency that every morning, the only thing they're supposed to do is this, so that we aren't waiting 10 to 20 years for a recovery. We can do it in 5 years, you know? And that, I think, is the big challenge, Rob. Yes, our elected officials our government officials, our career folks are doing everything they can, right? They're working incredible hours, incredibly disciplined, but they also have the rest of the county and the rest of the cities to take care of. And so we need a place that is a singular focus. I think my fear is that if we don't have that, there's always something else happening. I mean, look, Los Angeles, we got hit by the worst fire in our history, and then we've been hit by a federal occupation that's terrorizing our streets. So there's a lot going on in our city, and we need to have an agency that this is what they do morning, noon, and night, and they don't deviate from that mission. So yes, coordination can happen, and they're doing their darndest, but they are being pulled in a lot of different directions. And as you all know who are on this call and listening, all of our municipalities and counties are fiscally challenged right now because of what's going on federally, as well as just generally in the economy. I don't know, Laura, if you want to address the planning piece.
Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize too that we now have a much more formalized emergency management structure in the United States that even in the 2017 wildfires in Northern California wasn't as evident as it has been in LA to this point. And so there has been something called interagency recovery coordination that FEMA and Cal OES have been leading, working with the impacted cities and county in a series of task forces. Those task forces were stood up under the emergency response framework, the national response framework, and now they've transitioned into the what we're calling the national disaster recovery framework, but recovery support functions. And the other sort of really but to finish that thought, but FEMA is pulling back. They're closing the Joint Field Office on August 7th. There will still be a presence of FEMA to continue to dole out and deal with the public assistance applications that local governments have, but most of the individual assistance application process is complete. FEMA is also dealing with the allocation of the hazard mitigation money that was approved under Biden as part of this disaster declaration, something that so far this new administration hasn't done for any disaster. So that's basically a percentage of all the money that gets paid to the disaster declaration area for public assistance or individual assistance. A pot gets set aside for hazard mitigation money. So now there's an effort to get all of that money out and as I was mentioning, try to fill some of the gaps that normally would have come through supplemental appropriations. And also, if you follow all this stuff, there was a cancellation of a very important program to California called BRIC, the Buildings Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program. And so that hazard mitigation money, the state is really hoping is going to finish some of these projects that were already, ground cut and construction going on for climate projects, flood enhancement projects, wildfire projects. So those things are continuing, and that coordination is happening on managing those particular pots of money. But that is not long-term recovery directed. So as they pull back, there is going to be a bigger and bigger vacuum in coordination, because we just don't have, unless the county or somebody stands up some formal sort of coordination body going forward, you won't have that same interaction or drive that those programs were having, with that federal presence and their responsibility to get that money down to the state and from the state to the locals. So as the feds pull back, so in fact does the state, because the state sort of works, as an agent of the federal government in pushing the money down to the streets for those programs. And if we have another disaster, another big wildfire somewhere else this summer, our emergency managers need to go back to doing emergency management. That's what they're there for. And so I think, as Cecilia says, we want some directed ongoing focus on the long-term recovery for these areas because of the severity of the impacts.
I think we could have a whole session dealing with how we deal with the federal uncertainties, let's say, right now. And I saw there was a question about that too. But I think you're right that, having some kind of authority and taking the initiative locally is one way of dealing with that. But otherwise, I'll leave that to another session. In our last few minutes here, I was thinking that if we can think of focusing this towards our audience, and we've got all kinds of people in the audience who are California APA members, but they might be staff planners for area jurisdictions. I noticed the federal, state, there's planners for community nonprofits, advocates, students, planners who are eager to volunteer. So we have about 70 of them with us. And what might they be able to do along the lines of the message that you've given them? Are there things that they could help to promote some of your recommendations, or are there other kinds of actions that they might be able to be taking in the spirit of the things that you're talking about?
It looks like Laurie raised her hand. I don't know if you wanted to address that, Laurie. Laurie asked.
I'll just add like one thing I want to impart to our community on the call, which is we've taken action after a major catastrophic disaster to think about the road forward in a way that would lead the county and LA to be more resilient in the face of the next fire. I would say that for everyone working across California, this fire is not a one-off. That we need to make sure that we are integrating future risk reduction in everything we do, from permitting to underwriting to reform to policy. So in your respective communities, it is important that you champion that, because we do not want other communities in the place that LA is at today. That's the thing I would like to impart.
I would also recommend that folks, try to download the report. The first half of it is our recommendations. The second half of it is incredible. It is what our UCLA team did, some of the research. They brought out some of the case studies, some of the background research they did. They served us up some of the best experts worldwide on some of these issues, everything from habitat restoration to, clean energy grids to water management. So I would say that is very, very rich. Look at those recommendations as planners and think about how you can build that into your own resiliency plans, because this fire or something like it is coming to a community in your town. And we have to start to build that resiliency in. I know that many are already working on this, but you can now cite to this report our recommendations and the work of these UCLA researchers. And I think that can help you build a case in your own city and community for some of the investments that need to be made and the advanced planning that needs to be made, so that California can withstand our communities can withstand the coming catastrophes caused by climate change. That's what I think, Rob. I mean, that's what I think everybody who's a planner needs to do right now. Read these things and think about and start citing them in your own town so that you guys can get ahead of the curve.
Yeah, no, I think that's good advice. So I still keep thinking, and I'm trying to think of how much, well, what you guys are going to say on record here. But that the idea of the authority is a very powerful idea. But you hang a lot of ideas off of that, and if that doesn't happen, and you don't want to, you don't want to go there yet, but how can we be thinking about backfilling, if you will, to make sure there's as many of the kinds of ideas that's furthering would be able to occur.
I mean, I'll give you an example on community driven. It's incredible what community members have done in the Eaton burn area and Palisades. Outstanding ideas, really great work. We need to lift that up. And in that C1, recommendations we have in our report. So if you happen to be in the Los Angeles area and Southern California area, talk to philanthropy, talk to folks who are funders and say, you know what, if you do nothing else, go resource some of these local groups that are doing this work so that they can continue to move on with their lives, but also continue to direct the recovery of their communities. That's just one example. So I think all of these recommendations, yes, it'd be great if we got this authority. It would give it the oomph to accelerate what we know needs to happen. This is an extraordinary occurrence. And as I said, business as usual just won't work. But if we don't get an authority tomorrow or next year, we still have to do this work. And so we still have to organize amongst ourselves. We may not get any federal dollars. I'd like to think that we can make common cause with the people in Texas in North Carolina and other places, but we may be on our own. And so we need to have folks dig into this, look at those recommendations. There's so much on water management, so much on the energy grid, on resiliency around that, a ton of stuff on insurance. All of those recommendations, we can continue to try to move forward on them. It just won't have a single agency coordinating the recovery effort and the rebuilding effort. And I would think that would be unfortunate. But, you know, it may not happen in this session. Maybe it happens next year. But I think it's something that we need to continue to advocate for. And I might add this. As I noted, it's coming to a community near you. We just had fires in the Inland Empire in Riverside, devastating fires. Maybe they might need a recovery authority. Laurie liked to point out that Cal OES has this recommendation of having a rebuilding authority in its guidance for disaster recovery for the state of California. So it's in a state approved document that these types of authorities should be created. So if we don't get one, we should at least create a mechanism so that when disaster strikes, communities can form these types of authority to be able to have a coordinated recovery that incorporates communities' ideas and accelerates that rebuilding process. I can't tell you strongly enough. Again, I hope it happens for our communities, but if it doesn't, I hope it happens for the next community that's faced what we have faced.
Great, thanks. I see we're getting close to time, so I want to. Well, I just want to add that I love the recommendations on planning, and I'm glad you highlighted them today. And I would commend people to look at that. And I think the other really nice thing about this report, as we saw in the first slide, are all the things that we didn't talk about. So that, you know, you really covered a breadth of ideas, and you know, a lot of the news coverage, I'm not complaining about it. They've really focused on the most salient issues right now. But recovery after this fire is really, there's a great breadth of issues that aren't getting adequate attention. And I really commend you guys for laying all that out and describing how all those things are related to each other. So so we have the link so everybody can read the report. And you're right, it helps in this case, and it helps people to think more resiliently into the future. There will be other fires in other places. So thank you, everybody. This was really fabulous. I'm going to turn it back over to James to close us off here. And anyway, thanks, everybody. And this recording, well, James will probably say, but the recording will be available.
Yeah, Will. Thank you, Robin. Thank you so much to our panelists. This has been a fantastic discussion. I put in the chat just a brief reminder. Our webinars are now going to be CM credit eligible. Today's is actually included for the sustainability and resilience. We're currently working on our backlog of our prior 6 episodes that you can find online. So we'll make an announcement at some point when those are available. They're now also available for streaming at our website. So make sure you check back in with that. And I think we still got a few other webinars in our in the hopper. So please stay tuned for that. Both follow us on social or at apacalifornia.org, and we'll definitely be giving everyone a heads up with that. So with that, a big thanks to our panelists again, and thank you for spending your Friday lunchtime with us, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, everybody.